is Dr. Robert Chapman, and I would like to talk to you a little bit about the very important psychological and genetic concept, which is heritability. And it's about how our genes and environments shape us. In this talk, we're going to not look at the mechanics of how we study heritability. That will be a subsequent talk, but we're going to be focusing on the kind of implications and applications and sort of the philosophical aspects of heritability. We're going to consider what it is. We're going to see some really important things that I think you should know about heritability and why they're important, how they have real world applications. So the term heritability, take a moment and think, is it something you're familiar with? If it is, could you give a definition of heritability? Don't worry if that's struggle for you. It is a difficult concept for a lot of reasons. And in fact, a lot of people find it very difficult. So I've recently conducted some research with about 2,000 participants so far, where they were asked if a report stated the heritability of insomnia was 30%, what would that mean? And they were given 4 options to choose from. Now, 21% of the participants chose the correct answer. By far, the most popular response was actually a definition that's more aligned with the idea of heredity, the passing on of things from generation to generation. But when we talk about heritability in a scientific context, we're actually talking about genetic influences accounting for variation in population differences in a trait that we're looking at. Now, here's an example of some psychological traits. In this slide, the larger the font, the more heritable the trait. So here we have some personality measures. There's something called the Big Five personality measure, which has 5 components. One is extroversion, another is agreeableness. We'll get the other 3 in a moment. Artistic interests, schizophrenia, you can see here is quite large, so it's quite highly heritable. Major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and so on. Conscientiousness is another personality trait, as is neuroticism and openness. And this last one is by far the biggest, and it's intelligence in adulthood, which is an important caveat, which we'll come back to. So intelligence is about 80% heritable. And when we talk about heritability, we talk about it in percentages. So if something is entirely inheritable, it is 80%, it would be 100% heritable. Genetics would account for all the variation in a population. And if genetics aren't important at all, it would be 0% heritable. Now, there are some really important things I think you need to know about heritability that will help if this is something you're going to study, or even if you're just more generally interested in psychology and who we are and why we are the way we are. So the first thing is that heritability estimates apply to specific populations at specific times. They can be and often are different across development, across the lifespan, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail. We're going to look at all of these in more detail. Heritability always describes variance within a population, not differences between populations, and that's a really important one to get your head around. And just because something is highly heritable doesn't mean that it's determined, doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done about it, and that again is really important. Now, when we study heritability, we quite often use twins to study it because identical twins are genetic clones of each other. They share 100% of their genes, but non-identical twins are no more genetically similar than any sibling pairs, any brothers or sisters. But because they're twins, they have the same, their environments are just as similar as the similarity of the environments for identical twins. And so with that set up, we can start to pick apart genetic and environmental influences, which is really cool. Okay, so firstly, heritability describes specific influences, genetic influences on a specific population at a specific time. Now, in the earlier slide, one of the variables we looked at was religiousness. People were asked how religious they were. It was a subjective measure. And in the population that was studied, the heritability was found to be 0.28, so 25%. That means of all the variance in the school responses for that that questionnaire, environmental influences within that population accounted for 72% of the variance, and genetic influences accounted for 28%. Now, I want you to imagine an environment where there is a very strict state, a country, a state, a time in history where people had very little freedom. They were expected to adhere to a certain religion. The whole society was set up for that religion. There was very little kind of freedom to move away or worship another religion, for example. Now, because that environment is so stable, there's little variation in the environment. When we look at heritability, we're looking to account for all the variation. And so because environments, by being so stable, are accounting for less variance, then necessarily genetics would account for more, and we get a higher heritability in such an environment. If we imagine a completely opposite environment where there's no such constraints, people can do whatever they want, they can study, they can follow a religion or not, they can follow any religion, be as devout or as liberal as they want, we would see lower heritability because the environment is a lot more varied and it's accounting for more of the variance in the population. So when you look at heritability estimates, they are very broad. They might say the heritability was 0.28 or 28%, but it's better to think of them in more broad terms rather than absolute numbers, because that number would be different in different environments. So I think that's the first important concept. Secondly, and this may surprise you, but heritability can change across the lifespan. And we actually see this time and again when we look at intelligence or IQ. IQ tends to have low heritability in the early years, increasing through childhood, and then gets quite stable in adulthood at about 0.8, so 80% heritable. Now that might sound quite contradictory. How can genes become more important as you get older? Well, the theory is that when we're children, we have very little control over our environments. Those environments have a lot of variation. We don't choose the schools we go to. We don't choose the families we grow up in, the subjects we study, and there's a lot of variation. But as we grow, we're able to tailor our environments more and more to who we are and what we like to do. And so those environments become narrower and smaller. And just like we saw before, when an environment has less variation, genetics necessarily explain more of the variation. So as we build our environments to reflect our genetic interests, who we are, the environments become more aligned to that, and so the genetics become more pronounced. Another really important concept is that when we talk about heritability, we're talking about variation within a population, not variation between populations. And to get your head around this, I think it's quite useful to do a little thought experiment. So I want you to imagine a field of flowers or corn or crops or whatever it might be. It's a really well-tended field. It's well looked after. There's lots of nutrients in the soil, lots of rain, sunshine, everything the plants need to grow. Now, in that field, as they grow, there will be some variation. Some of the plants will be a little bit bigger, some will be smaller, some will have more seeds, some will have bigger flowers, whatever it might be. Those differences would be mostly accounted for by genetic differences between the crops in those fields. The environmental differences would be very small because the environment is so static. Now imagine another field where you've planted the same crop, but this is a very poor field. It has poor nutrition in the soil, it doesn't get much rain, maybe too much sun. Those plants, those that still grow, will show variation and maybe show more variation, but that again, the variation will be attributable to genetic factors because the environment is so static. So in both fields, if we measured it, we would record quite high heritability, but that doesn't mean that the differences between those two fields are because of genetic differences. In this case, they are almost entirely going to be because of environmental differences. Now, take a minute to think about that and apply it to an educational or clinical setting. there have been studies that have identified, for example, race differences in IQ. Now, there's a whole field of research about what exactly is race. Does it make any sense? And in fact, in genetic terms, it doesn't. But if we find differences between different groups in something like IQ, it doesn't necessarily follow that that's caused by genetic differences between those groups. One isn't genetically better or smarter than the other. It could be that the environments are explaining the differences. So if for example, you conduct research in a country like the North America, it could be that poor schooling, poor social economic status, poor housing, these are the things that are actually driving the differences that are seen in IQ scores and not genetics. And in fact, that's what we find in the research pretty conclusively. So a really important concept there, one to really sit with, I would say. And then the last one I want to give you or go through with you is this idea that if something is highly heritable, it doesn't mean it's determined. People can be quite essentialist in their thinking. You know, if it's in my genes, there's nothing I can do about it. Well, that's not true. There's a really good example of this, a medical condition called phenylketonuria, which we call PKU. And it's something you inherit from your parents. And if you have PKU, you lack a genetic variant that produces an enzyme that breaks down something called phenylalanine, which is in all our diets. Everything we eat, or almost everything we eat, contains this phenylalanine. Now, most of us who don't have PKU, we have the mechanism to deal with that. We can break it down and remove it from our bodies. But people with PKU can't do that. So if they eat foods with phenylalanine in, they get very sick. And if it happens in childhood, it can lead to all sorts of developmental delays and physical difficulties. So in the UK, we do something called a heel prick test as soon as a baby is born, and then we look for phenylketonuria as well as other conditions to see if they have it. And if they do, that baby can instantly be started on a diet that doesn't contain phenylalanine. And by making that environmental intervention, they will never go on to develop the symptoms of PKU. So here we have a 100% genetic condition, but 100% environmental intervention. So being highly heritable, being 100% heritable doesn't mean determined. And that's a really important concept to sit with. If you're interested with PKU, there's a lot about it on the internet. And there's this very interesting video. It's a slightly uncomfortable watch, but it's the doctor who first discovered it. He video recorded in the 50s his casework with a small child who had PKU, and it's quite an interesting watch. Okay, so just to recap, we've talked about heritability estimates not being able to talk about anything other than the specific population at a specific time. We've realized that heritability estimates can be and often are different across development, and that heritability describes variance within a population, not differences between populations. I would say that's one of the most important ones. And so is this, actually. High heritability does not mean that something is determined. Okay, so there's some sort of conceptual frameworks. Let's apply them. Because not understanding these aspects of heritability, it does have some real world implications, not just kind of philosophical ones. And in the case of genetics in general and heritability in particular, it could be the case that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Researchers have proposed this model called the mixed blessing model. It was developed by Haslam and Kvail in relation to clinical practices and has recently been adapted to educational settings by Larson and colleagues. So the model goes something like this. If you provide a genetic explanation of, for example, a learning disability like dyslexia or ADHD or behavioral difficulties to a teacher, that teacher will then take that information and use it. And they may use it in a good way. They may say, well, look, because of that strong genetic influence, it's not the child's fault. They're not misbehaving because they're naughty. They're misbehaving because they can't help it. Or they're struggling to read because they can't help it. And because it's out of their control, it's not right to assign blame. So this is sort of the good part of the mixed model. Conversely, especially if the teacher has what are called just genetic essentialism beliefs, it could lead to some difficulties. So it could lead to social separation or exclusion. This idea that, well, there's nothing to be done. They shouldn't be in a mainstream school setting. They need to be taught in a special unit or something. It could be that it leads to pessimism about learning progress. Well, if dyslexia is highly genetic, then this child will never learn to read. So why bother? It can also lead to a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the teacher is sort of looking for problems because they have this information about genetics, then it might actually make the problems more likely. If the teacher's thinking, well, this child can't help behaving badly, every little thing the child does would be seen as bad behavior. The teacher may then become more strict, the child then may become more rebellious, and the behavior would get worse and worse. This is shown to have kind of strong applications in clinical settings, and I think is showing some promising work in education as well. So that's a real world application. We're going to pick up one in a bit as well, which is quite positive. But first of all, I want to talk about how people estimate heritability. So you saw some heritability estimates earlier on, and in fact, people are quite good at that on average. So if we ask lots of people, the average responses that they give are quite close to the actual responses. So on the left here, we have responses from a large data set. That's about 5,000 people. And on the right, we have the actual heritability estimates taken from meta-analyses. These are studies of studies, so they are kind of really robust, and they draw together lots of different studies. So these are quite strong estimates, and we can see generally people are quite close. But on some traits, people are overestimating or tending to. And if we look at these, eye color, height, IQ, sexual orientation, some of these we might think of as quite fixed. You can't change your height, you can't change your eye color. Arguably, you can't change your IQ, etc. So we might consider these fixed traits. Conversely, people seem to be underestimating for traits that we might consider more malleable. So weight, achievement, and motivation, things that are sort of within our conscious control. And this may be reflecting this idea of genetic essentialism. It's written in our genes. And if we can't do something about it, it's more genetic. If we can, it's less genetic. Something to think about there. I just wanted to talk particularly about sexual orientation as one of the things that people are asked to estimate. And I've just presented the data in a slightly different way for a variety of different countries. Just to show you here, for example, in Argentina, 29% of our participants, and to be fair, there were only 90, so it's not a large sample, but about 30% of them said that there were no genetic influences at all in sexual orientation. It was all environmental. And I think there are some interesting patterns of results here. So have a little think about those, see what you think. There are, I think, definite implications for research in those areas as well. Okay, now this is, I think, a really positive and good application of a little bit of understanding about heritability and relative gene influences of genes and environments. So this is the idea of the genetic counseling jars. And the idea here is every one of us has a jar, which is our capacity to cope with stress. Now, some of us have a lot of genetic risks in our jar, which means that there's less capacity for us to manage the world. Some of us have far fewer genetic risks, so our jar is quite empty to start off with. Then life happens. Environmental stresses come along and add to that jar. Somebody who has quite high risk can take fewer of those stresses until their jar fills up, at which point there may be some kind of acute episode or something. But those of us with less genetic risk have more capacity to cope with environmental stresses. And this is something that's being found to work quite well in clinical settings because it helps people who are essentialist, either environmentally essentialist, I only feel this way because of my environment, or genetically essentialist. I'm only this way because of what the genes I inherited from my parents. They had depression, I have depression, there's nothing I can do. In both cases, this jar analogy can help those people reframe those essentialist beliefs and engage better with therapeutic services. And there seems to be good research for this. And I think there would be interesting ways of applying this in education. So a nice positive kind of note on why understanding heritability matters. So take a little bit of time now and see if you've got a better grasp of heritability. Maybe jot some notes down. I'll give you the dictionary definitions. A lot of people start with this first definition, which is exactly what we saw at the data at the beginning. Just over half of the population chose a response that sort of fits with this: the quality or state of being inheritable or heritable, something that can be passed from one person to another. Genetic information if you have children, but it could even be like your house or your car or your grandfather's watch. If those are passed down through generations, then they are heritable. They have heritability. But what we mean in a scientific context of this second definition, the proportion of observed variation in a particular trait, such as height, that can be attributed to inherited genetic factors in contrast to environmental ones. Now, don't worry if that sounds complicated. It is complicated. You've come a great way in understanding this concept of heritability. Take some time, have some conversations, think about what it means. It will take a while to really kind of settle into the understanding, but I hope by covering some of those key concepts, it will give you some tools to engage with that conversation. Okay, so some further reading if you're interested. This is an academic paper. It's quite an intense read. It's quite a difficult read, I have to say. So if you're going to tackle that, you might want to try a reading strategy that I often use. It's called SQ3R. There's a little bit of information about it on the screen there, but do Google that. I think it could be quite useful. This is a really nice paper more generally about the field of behavioral genetics, but within that it talks a lot about heritability as well. So that's a good paper to have a look at. And we also have a website, the Accessible Genetics Consortium. So do come and check us out there if you're interested. If you'd like some other options, here are some films to consider. Just with the films and the books and the novels I'm going to put on the screen, just be quite critical. Don't take what they're describing as absolutely true. For example, Gattaca is 25 years old, and we know so much more about genetics now than we did then. But they're still interesting films to watch and think about. There's some good textbooks if you're thinking about studying behavioral genetics and heritability. There's some excellent textbooks there. Some non-fiction. So if you're not studying it, but you're interested and you like non-fiction, then there's a couple of good books I can recommend there. And I mentioned before, there's some novels here. Brave New World is nearly 100 years old. And this Margaret Atwood trilogy is probably about 15 years old. So again, bear in mind that we know a lot more than we did then. Here are the references that I used in the paper. And I just wanted to say thank you for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. My contact details are there on the screen, so if you want to email me, do please feel free. Thank you so much.